With today's Boxing Day sales, some retail staff may have faced the wrath of angry and rude customers. So it'd be quite a good idea, I think, anyway, to understand how we can deal with rude customers or how to tackle that rudeness if we're about to be that way. Nathaniel Wells is a psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists and hopefully has some advice for us. Hi, Nathaniel.
Hi, Ashwin. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, are you in a retail environment? Are you seeing this behaviour?
I have many clients who work retail jobs, and I'm actually a past victim of angry customers myself, having worked at Woolworths for a number of years while I was going through my degree.
Well, that's a common story because so many of us work in retail to get through uni and study and in general. So let's start with the impact. What impact can rude behaviour have on a staff member?
Well, I mean, we can start with the fatigue that a retail worker already goes through just doing their job. And you pile on dealing with angry customer after angry customer on top of that. And that's emotional labour on top of the labour that they're already doing being a retail worker during the holidays. So it can take a huge toll that's quite unseen by others and sometimes unrecognised by the worker themselves, and they may get home and can feel completely deflated and then have to go again, let alone the impact on their mental health as well.
It's the influence of 1,000 cuts. So tell us about some of that impact when you're constantly barraged by rudeness. Does it lead to anxiety, depression, resignation, hopelessness? What sort of psychological trajectory do you see in people getting constantly treated that way for years?
Oh, I think we can start with the anxiety in that is the biggest impact that I see in that a person can deal with one or two rude customers and come away from that and generally feel pretty well regulated and okay. But then if you're dealing with it time and again through years, every single holiday period, you have a lot of very anxious retail workers going into work who are rehearsing imagined scenarios in their heads every single shift, where customers may abuse them for something they may not have even done. It's quite severe.
Yeah, and that cortisol, that hypervigilance, that must be associated with lots of different conditions, right? If you're constantly in that fight or flight mode, it's not supposed to be used all day, every day.
No, certainly not. And that cortisol stress response, it fatigues the muscles, it keeps you on high alert. And then if you're spending a whole shift on high alert for rude customers, you're naturally going to go home and feel pretty awful and then may not even switch off from work because you're imagining what it's going to be like the next day going again.
Why do the holidays, do you think, bring out this kind of behaviour in people?
Often it's because people are thrown out of routine or people aren't their regular selves or they may not feel like they have a great degree of control over their lives at that point and they need to be in different places at different times. They may feel rushed. There's plenty of different reasons which, when we say them objectively, don't really give people an excuse to then abuse a poor retail staff member. But when you add them up in people who are quite rude, their emotion regulation capacity is quite low in themselves, hence why they may project their difficulties with their own emotions onto a poor retail worker.
Yeah, why don't we do a slight psychological profile of the rude person as much as the literature can share? Is it parental upbringing? Is it genetics? Is it the big five personality traits? Some people are less agreeable than others. What's going on there to constitute a rude person?
Oh, I can take 100 different guesses and I will probably be slightly right or slightly wrong every single time. It could be partially different bits of personality traits. Sometimes it can be a difficulty inherent in the person regulating their own angry emotions, having seen their parents do it themselves when they were young. Sometimes it can just be a person really struggling in themselves who may have anxiety and depression themselves and may not be able to handle their own emotions at that time during Christmas, or it can sometimes even be just the people who are struggling in themselves during Christmas with their own loneliness or difficulty being away from family who let out some of that emotion and may regret it themselves afterwards as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There was that saying, hurt people hurt people. That's what the latter explanation you were giving is they're in pain and they're lashing out. But sometimes they don't perhaps deserve that kind of charitable interpretation. There's a bit of psychopathy or just rudeness for rudeness' sake, isn't there?
I like the way you used explanation, but not an excuse there.
Yes, yeah. Okay, all right. If you are hearing this conversation and you're a retail worker that has some experience of being treated rudely, you can text on 0467 922 612, or you can call 1300 800 222. I'm Ashwin Segkar, and I'm talking to Nathaniel Wells, who is a psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists. What can a retail worker do at the end of the day to recover after a day of dealing with this kind of behaviour?
That can be really tricky because there can be a lot of residual anxiety or a lot of nervous system regulation that you may need to do at the end of the day to just bring yourself down. And what I often encourage with retail workers is to make sure that you're doing your best to leave work at work and trying not to spend too much time thinking about work or ruminating about work when you get home. So often what I recommend people to do is take a drive home or get home in any way that you sort of do. And if you find yourself still thinking about work by the time you get home, chuck another lap of the block or go for a bit of a walk around the neighbourhood. And then when you're ready to stop thinking about work and you've given yourself enough time to think about work and what's happened that day, then you can take your uniform off.
Yes.
But you can't take your uniform off until you've finished off thinking about that stuff. And remember that your emotions and your response to angry and rude customers are completely valid. You don't deserve that treatment. And their treatment of you says nothing about you. It's all about them.
Yeah, that's really nice to reframe it as well. But sometimes, you stop thinking about work, but at 2 a.m., your subconscious says, hey, I'm still thinking about work. And it wakes you up and it has a solution or an argument. And I wish I'd said this. Is there any way to address the subconscious as well in dealing with this issue?
Definitely. So if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're still thinking about work, you're thinking about what you could have said, make sure that you get out of the bed to do that, because otherwise your brain will start to conditionally associate your bed with ruminating about working further. So make sure you get out of the bed and then write down that response, or just get it out of your head and into the notes app in your phone, or even better yet, just handwritten so you don't have to look at blue light at 2 a.m. And then when you're ready to stop thinking about work, then you get it.
Okay, so these are good tips for how to care for yourself after work. What about some communication tips for dealing with the customer in the moment?
Now, this one's a tricky one because often what we respond with when someone is angry or rude to us is defense, and that's natural. But what we can do, if we're regulated enough in ourselves, is repeat back to the angry customer exactly what they've just said to you, but in a kind of summarized sort of way. So you're reflecting back to that person exactly what they've just said to you in a way that kind of holds the mirror up to them. So you can repeat in a summarized fashion exactly what they've said so that they can reconsider exactly what they've said, and they can also feel heard, because one of the big things that defuses angry people is feeling heard and feeling understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. I can imagine that would be quite effective, but there must be a moment where it takes them to calm down, because they must be, some of them, in their reptile brain, the limbic brain, before you can bring them back to that considerate, planning, neocortex brain where you can reason with them.
And that takes patience. So just reflecting back to them what they said, or saying, yeah, I hear that, I understand that, that sounds really frustrating. It gives them the time to start to kind of come down, because that limbic brain may start to defuse a little bit if you try those strategies.
Okay. All right, so those are some good tips, holistic tips. Some of them are for you at home, some of them are for you with the customer. Let's turn our attention to the person being rude. What can they do? I mean, a lot of them, if they're rude, they might not want to change, but say you do. Say you know you have a short temper and you'd like to work on your rudeness. What tips would you have for those people?
I would start to identify what sort of triggers you. For starters, if there have been moments where you've been rude to retail workers, try to see if there's a bit of a pattern. See if there's a pattern of specific things that come up for you, whether or not it's when you scan something in the self-checkout and it doesn't scan properly and you've got to call the attendee. Is that a trigger for you? Or is it standing in line at the checkout for too long? Is that a trigger for you? because then you can start to put in some strategies yourself to bring your nervous system down, because when you get angry, that's your nervous system activating in that fight or flight. And that's your responsibility to calm down. So you can do some breathing strategies or some distraction strategies, of which you can find heaps online.
I wonder if those triggers can also point to a deeper value that we might have. So say the checkout doesn't work. That annoys us, but why does that annoy us? Maybe we have this deeper value that things should just run on time, or my time is precious and it's being wasted. There might be some value behind the trigger that's really annoying you. Is it a chance for people to work out why they're getting angry and what that says about what they value?
It's a brilliant moment for reflection, if you feel like you're capable, to look at how you're interpreting that moment of the checkout delay and asking yourself, what's going through my mind right now? And seeing if you can pinpoint a couple of thoughts like, oh my God, I'm going to be late, or someone's deliberately doing this to me, when in actual fact they may not, or it could just be something outside your control. It's a good moment to ask yourself what's going through my mind.
Nathaniel, do you have any final tips you can leave us with when it comes to dealing with rudeness this summer?
I think the best possible thing is to validate yourself and validate your own responses, that you are allowed to feel hurt or upset if a customer is rude to you, and make sure you do the same to those rude customers so that they calm down and you don't escalate them further. So saying, I hear you, I understand, that sounds frustrating.
Nathaniel, thanks for your company and your advice today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.